Before starting, I want to be clear. I'm not here on behalf of any organization. No federation asked me to do this, no donor is underwriting it, and no board approved this message. I am a father, a husband, a lawyer, and a Canadian Jew who has been paying close attention, and I have some things that I want to say. What follows is entirely my own. Now, I'm recording this on the eve of Passover. Passover is the story of a people who were told for generations that the conditions of their oppression were simply the condition of their lives, that there was no alternative, no exit, no future worth imagining. And then something changed. Everything changed. Spring arrived. Something was renewed, and a people that had been told that it had no future discovered that it did, and that the future required them to move towards it and not wait for it to arrive. I wasn't born here, nor did I come to this country. I was brought here. I was one. My parents decided that South Africa was no longer safe and that Canada was the place that said yes. I had no opinion on the matter. I had no language for it. That's how a lot of us got here, not by some grand design, not by conviction, but by luck and paperwork and someone somewhere stamping an approval and a set of parents who made a decision that changed everything. My parents fell in love with this country the way that immigrants do, not with its politics or its mythology, but by its texture. The way that a hockey game feels in February, the way a Toronto spring arrives like something you didn't know you'd been waiting for. The way that people here hold a door open for a stranger and mean it. We built our lives here. I built a family here. I met my wife here. I made a career here. We have 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, and they go to school here. Canada isn't a country I chose the way you choose a meal off a menu. It's a country that chose my family first, and I chose it back with everything that I had as an adult, with full knowledge of what I was choosing. So when I sit here and tell you that we're in trouble, that Canadian Jewry is facing something that we haven't faced in a long time, I want you to understand that this isn't a speech of someone who hates this country, or has given up on it, or who is looking for an exit. It's the speech of someone who loves it enough to be honest about it. Now, I've been trying to read everything, every op-ed, every community letter, every thread, every lament, though I gave up a long time ago on reading every WhatsApp message. There is no shortage of writing about how dark things are in Canada for Jews. And much of it is accurate. But I've noticed something underneath a lot of it, something that writers rarely say out loud. Most of us don't actually want to leave. Deep down, most Canadian Jews want to stay here. We want our children to grow up here. We want to make this country as good as it can be. We sometimes say otherwise, we threaten, we fantasize, we catastrophize. But what we say isn't always what we think. And what we think, if we're honest, is, I want to fight for this place. I just need someone to tell me that it's worth fighting for. And this is me telling you that I believe that it's worth fighting for. So let's begin with what happened in early March. Synagogues in the Greater Toronto area were shot at. They weren't vandalized, they were shot at. Bullets entered buildings where we pray, buildings where our children learn. And when I talk to people about it, I notice something troubling in the responses. There's shock, yes, but beneath the shock, there's a familiarity that should disturb all of us. A sense of course. Of course this happened. We've been watching it coming for a while now. And that normalization itself is a crisis. When the physical targeting of Jewish houses of worship starts to feel like an expected development rather than an unthinkable one, something has shifted in the moral atmosphere of this country. And we shouldn't let that shift pass without naming it directly. Now, I know that in some circles, talking about Jewish vulnerability invites accusations of exaggeration. So let's begin with putting some numbers on the table. In 2024, B'nai B'rith recorded 6,219 anti-Semitic incidents. It's the highest number ever documented since their audit began in 1982. That's not a spike or just a bad year. That's 17 incidents of hate every single day. Every single day. While you were dropping your kids off at school, while you were sitting in traffic, while you were making dinner, 17 times, somewhere in this country, a Jew was targeted for being a Jew. And those are just the reported cases. Jewish Canadians make up roughly 1% of this country's population, and yet we account for 19% of all police-reported hate crimes. In-person harassment has grown by nearly 60% between 2022 and 2024. And we aren't imagining this. We aren't being dramatic. The data is unambiguous. And it's not abstract. Jewish schools have been shot at and firebombed. A Jewish school bus was torched. A Jewish bookstore was smashed. Bomb threats have been called in to community centers. The National Holocaust Monument in Ottawa, a monument to murdered Jews, was defaced. Synagogues are now encased in bulletproof glass. When charges are laid against perpetrators, they are frequently dropped. The messages sent to people doing this is that there are no consequences. And so they continue. Some of our children are removing their Star of David necklaces before they walk into school. Again, that's Jewish children in Canadian schools hiding who they are because they have learned that being visibly Jewish makes them a target. More than 40% of reported incidents in Ontario's K-12 schools involve Nazi salutes or Holocaust denial. On university campuses, Jewish students describe being excluded and isolated and surrounded by hostility. And a recent study found that 31% of Jewish doctors in Ontario are considering leaving the country. And those are people who's built their careers and lives around helping others. Now, I'm telling you all of this because I refuse to be accused of minimizing what's happening. I'm not minimizing it. It's serious. The fear is real, the incidents are real, the data is real, and anyone who says otherwise is either lying or not paying attention. And I'm also telling you this because I think the response to all of it matters. Fear is information. What we do with that information, that's the question that I want to spend the rest of this speech on. And before I move on, I want to name something that statistics alone cannot capture. Now, Jesse Brown, the founder of Canada Land, an important independent journalist in this country, he recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic that I think every Canadian Jew and every Canadian should read. He called today what's happening a polite pogrom. His argument is that alongside the violence and vandalism, there's something quieter and in some ways more corrosive happening. That Jews are being pushed out of public life, out of universities, out of newsrooms, out of hospitals, out of institutions that they helped to build. Not with fire, but with DEI frameworks that don't recognize anti-Semitism as a category, with union policies that ostracize Jewish members, and with institutional indifference that makes staying untenable. And Brown makes an observation that I can't stop thinking about, that nobody is counting. The institutions from which Jews are quietly disappearing, they don't collect data with Jewish as a category of self-identification, which means that the numbers I just cited, as alarming as they are almost certainly undercounts. We're only measuring what we can see, and we have no idea how much we cannot. A polite pogrom. That's where we are. So let me talk about our politicians. Now, I work in immigration law. I've spent years in the federal court in submissions to ministers in reading the language of the state carefully for what it actually means beneath what it says. So when I watch Canadian politicians responding to anti-Semitism, I watch with a type of professional attention. And what I see is fecklessness dressed up as diplomacy. We have governments at every level that can draft a press release in under an hour. They can convene an emergency debate. They can express grave concern with the same fluency they bring to everything else they express. What they can't seem to do is act in a way that imposes any cost on those who target Jews. Canada recognized a Palestinian state. Now, I want to be precise about what I think about that, because I'm not necessarily a maximalist on the question of Palestinian statehood in 2026. What I am is a realist about timing and incentive. We as a country recognized the state while Israeli hostages, both dead and alive, were still being held in Gaza. Jewish men and women and children taken on October 7th, some of them still alive in tunnels while Canadian diplomats were signing documents handing over more power to their captors. We recognized that state at a moment when the Palestinian government, if you can call something so dismembered a government, was run by people whose founding charter called for our destruction, by people who sympathize with the terrorists who perpetrated October 7th and every terror attack before and since. At a moment when Jewish communities in Canada were being targeted, at a moment when anti-Semitism on our streets was metastasizing visibly. And let's be honest about why. Jewish Canadians represent roughly 1% of the population. Arab and Muslim Canadians represent somewhere between 3 and 4% of the population. And crucially, they're concentrated in swing ridings in exactly the cities who decide Canadian elections. Now, I'm not saying this to cast suspicion on Arab or Muslim Canadians, who are absolutely as entitled to political representation as anyone else. I'm saying this because our politicians made a calculation, and we have to name that calculation for what it was. When governments weigh what communities' concerns to prioritize, they count. And right now, in the writings that matter, we are being counted and found wanting, not because our cause is less just, but because our numbers are smaller. And in some cases, our political loyalty has been taken for granted for far too long. The message sent to every person in this country who marches on the streets calling for the elimination of Israel was, your pressure works. Whereas the message sent to every Jewish family watching their community under assault was, you are not the constituency that matters right now. That's not foreign policy. That is an abdication. And it's not just the Liberals. The NDP has become, in any honest accounting, an anti-Israel party. Not a party critical of Israeli policy, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. There's a difference, and they've crossed it. And when I watch someone like Avi Lewis, a man who comes from one of the most storied families in Canadian Jewish public life, a family that built institutions that served this community for generations, when I watch him carry that lineage into a movement that has made common cause with those who would see Israel destroyed, there are no polite words. That is a betrayal of our community and of Canadian values. Period. And the police, I want to be careful because I know that there are individuals in law enforcement who are doing their jobs with integrity and courage. I know that the police officers are standing outside of our schools and our shuls and our community buildings, and I am genuinely grateful for that. The men and women who show up every day to protect our institutions deserve our thanks, and they get it. But the institutional record since October 7th has been, at best, inconsistent. There are documented cases of Jewish community members reporting threats and harassment and receiving responses that would be unrecognizable to any victim of a different targeted group. There are marches that have crossed every legal and moral line and received what can only be described as a permissive audience from law enforcement. I know that there have been some recent changes, but it's too late. Most synagogues now require private security because the public infrastructure cannot or will not provide meaningful protection. And you know a community is in trouble when it has to pay twice for its own safety, once in taxes and once out of pocket. We are now paying twice. Now let me talk about our schools. Because if there is a place where the long-term project of Canadian Jewry is either built or eroded, it's in the education of our children. My kids go to Jewish day school, and I want to tell you something about those schools right now. They are bursting at the seams, thank God. Since first COVID-19 and then since October 7th, enrollment has surged. Parents who were on the fence have made the decision. Families who assumed the public school would serve their children well enough have reconsidered. The demand for Jewish day school education in the city is greater than it has been in years, and it's not slowing down. And that is both a blessing and a challenge. We need more space. We need more capacity. We need to be able to say yes to every Jewish family that wants this for their children. That requires money and vision and institutional will. It also requires all of us. But we cannot abandon the public system either. The majority of Jewish children in this country still attend public schools, and those children deserve a community that fights for them too. The mainstream Jewish kids, the kids who love Israel, who went to camp, who go to camp, who had or will be having bar or bat mitzvahs, who carry an identity that is 3,000 years old. Those kids are sitting in a Canadian classroom right now, and the equity framework surrounding them has been quietly, methodically rewritten to treat their identity as a problem. We're watching something troubling happen now in school boards across this country. The framework known as anti-Palestinian racism, APR, has been imported into equity policies in ways that effectively treat any expression of Jewish attachment to Israel as suspect. Criticizing specific Israeli government policies is not anti-Semitism. No reasonable Jewish person thinks that, and most engage in such criticism. But defining Jewish identity itself, the attachment to the land of Israel that has been part of Jewish religious and cultural life for 3,000 years, as a form of racial oppression, that's not equity. That is ideology. And it has no place in a publicly funded school. My 3 kids are going to grow up in this country. And I want them to do that with their full identity intact. Their Canadianness and their Jewishness and their love of Israel without having to choose which one they are allowed to carry into a classroom or a university lecture hall. That is not too much to ask. It's actually the bare minimum. But I want to say something else too, because the problem in our schools is not only what's being done to Jewish children from the outside, it's also what I think we're failing to give them from the inside. Now, we've developed a habit of teaching Israel as a debate rather than an inheritance. We hand our kids a shield, talking points, historical facts, legal arguments, but we forget to give them a home. A child who knows that Israel is only a controversy to be defended has been given ammunition and no foundation. The first time that someone challenges them on campus or at a dinner table, they either fight or they fold because they were never given anything deeper to stand on. And the deeper thing is the story. It's not the timeline, but the story. The unbroken chain from Sinai to the kibbutzniks draining swamps to paratroopers at the Western Wall to the hostages coming home in 2025. The idea that Jewish history is not a collection of episodes scattered across other people's civilizations, but one continuous, unfinished project, and that every Jewish kid alive today is part of it, that's not a debate position. It's an inheritance. And you can't fight for something you were never taught to love. The day schools bursting at the seams, right there, that's an opportunity. But only if we fill those seats with that kind of education. Capacity without content is just a bigger room. So here's something that I genuinely believe about Canadian Jews that I don't actually think we say enough. We are uniquely equipped for this moment. This country taught us something that very few Jewish communities in the diaspora have had the opportunity to learn. Canada is a place that's built on the explicit recognition that you can hold more than one identity at once. We're actually built on it. The French and the English did not disappear into each other. They remained themselves. The immigrants who arrived from every corner of the world weren't asked to abandon their languages or their customs or their loyalties. They were asked to add Canada to what they already were. And this is not a small thing. In America, the great bargain was assimilation, the so-called melting pot. You came in as Polish or Italian or Jewish, and you became American with everything that implied about what had to go. Canada, however, was never really intended to work that way. The founders of this country didn't want a melting pot. They wanted a mosaic. You came in as yourself, and Canada asked, what can you contribute? That ethos made space for people like me at a time when none wasn't too many. It made space for Jewish people to be exactly what Jewish people have always been. A people who carry their entire civilization with them wherever they go. So when someone tells me that being a Zionist and being a Canadian are in conflict, that you have to choose between your attachment to Israel and your loyalty to this country, I want to say clearly that that is not a Canadian argument. It's an American import. It has no place in this country's political vocabulary, and it never did. Canadian Jews are not a hyphenated people who have to apologize for the second half of their identity. We are the fullest expression of what this country imagined when it imagined itself. We are both things, fully. We have to express that without apology. Now, about us. First, about our institutions, our federations, our UJA. Now let me be specific about what we're actually talking about, because I think some of the people who are loudest in their criticism have, in some respects, forgotten. UJA funds Jewish day schools, the very schools whose enrollment is surging right now because parents want their children to have a Jewish education. It funds Jewish camps where generations of kids have had their most formative Jewish experiences. It funds Birthright, which have sent tens of thousands of young Canadian Jews to Israel for the first time and in some ways changed the trajectory of their Jewish lives. It helps fund the JCCs, the buildings where your kids swim, where your parents go to stay active, where the community gathers. It funds services for the elderly, employment programs, mental health support, food banks. It funds to a certain extent the organizations that are fighting anti-Semitism and in the courts and in the corridors of power. Federation is not an abstraction. It's the infrastructure that makes Jewish life in this city possible, and most of us are swimming in it without noticing the water. Now, is federation, any federation in this country, perfect? No. No institution that large, that complex, gets everything right all the time. Criticism is legitimate. Ideas are welcome, and not just from the donors. If you think that something should be done differently, tell them and make the case. That's how institutions improve, and the best ones genuinely want to hear it. In many cases, our Canadian Jewish institutions have never had much competition, which leads to things going stale. Competition is good. It challenges people and institutions to do better, and it's needed. There is, however, always a microscope looming over our community, and we owe it to each other to have these fights with both grace and dignity. There's a difference between criticism that builds and criticism that tears down. One comes with an idea. The other comes with a grievance. You don't have to love every decision an institution makes to recognize that without it, something irreplaceable disappears. So before anyone picks up the megaphone, what happens to the people being served if these institutions are weakened? If you don't have a serious answer to that question, put down the megaphone. We don't need to attack each other. We have enough enemies. And that brings me to the people I am less willing to be gentle about. I'm talking about the anti-Zionist Jews, the ones who march with our enemies, the ones who give interviews to media who would never even cover a pogrom, the ones who make careers out of being acceptable Jews, the as a Jew, the un-Jew, the one the progressive establishment can point to and say, see, even the Jews agree with us. This is not dissent. Dissent is honorable. Dissent is Jewish. What this is, lending your Jewish name and your Jewish face to a movement whose goals include the destruction of the world's only Jewish state at a moment when synagogues in your country are being shot at, is far closer to betrayal. You're not a brave truth teller. You aren't a poor kid who didn't learn about the Palestinians sufficiently in day school. You're providing cover. And the community you're providing cover against is the one that will still show up for you if you needed it. Now, I'm not calling for anyone to be silenced. In Canada, people can say what they want. I am, however, calling for the community to stop treating this as respectable internal debate and start naming it for what it is. There is a difference between a Jew who criticizes the Israeli government and a Jew who makes common cause with those who want Jews dead. We have been, I believe, too polite about that distinction for too long. I'm not standing here to tell anyone to tear anything down, and I'm not standing here to tear anything down myself. I'm standing here to build something. But you cannot build a foundation that's been undermined from within. So, stop attacking the institutions that feed the poor and protect the vulnerable. And let's start being honest about who, in this community, has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Now, I know what a lot of people are thinking. I know because I hear it at Shabbat tables and in school parking lots and in the hallways after shul. Some people look at all of this, the shootings, the politicians, the schools, the division, and they say, maybe it's time to go. Florida, Texas, Israel. Those are the communities that feel safer. The places where you don't necessarily have to hold your breath every time there's a headline. I understand that impulse too. I feel it. I won't pretend that the thought hasn't crossed my mind on a dark day. But I do want to push back on it hard. And I want to push back not with a lecture, but with some honesty, because I think that the people saying just leave aren't being honest with themselves or with us. And I want to start with something that I do actually believe. I love the idea of aliyah. The word itself, aliyah, it means going up, a rising of the soul. There's something in it that speaks to everything that I find beautiful about Zionism. The idea that a Jewish return to the land isn't just a political project, but a spiritual one. And if all things were equal, and I could wave a wand and transplant my family and my career and my community overnight, then yeah, I totally understand the appeal. I feel it. Israel is extraordinary. But all things aren't equal. And I think we need to stop pretending that they are. Israel is a country at war. It's one of the most expensive places in the world to live. Housing prices in Tel Aviv make Vancouver look reasonable. The bureaucracy is formidable. The social pressures are real. Uprooting a family, pulling children out of school, leaving careers, learning to navigate a new system in a totally new language is not necessarily a lifestyle upgrade if that's what people are looking for. It's an enormous undertaking that most families, if they're being honest, are simply not in a position to do. So telling someone in distress that the answer is to move to Israel is, I'm sorry, not solidarity. It's a conversation ender that's dressed up in advice. Florida and Texas are different conversations. I also understand the appeal. Warm weather, lower taxes, large Jewish communities, a political climate that feels way more comfortable right now. I'm not here telling anyone where to live, and I genuinely mean that. If you've made that move and it's right for your family, I totally respect that. But I want to gently push back on the idea that this is a solution for everyone. Every place in the world is subject to political change. The American political climate that feels hospitable today looked very different 10 years ago and may look very different 10 years from now. Moving to a red state to escape the progressive politics making your Canadian city uncomfortable is a reasonable short-term calculation, but I don't know if it's a permanent answer, in my opinion. There are no permanent answers to anti-Semitism except a Jewish community strong enough to defend itself wherever it lives. The community exists here. It needs to be built, not abandoned. To me, leaving is not a strategy, it's a feeling. And feelings may sometimes lead us somewhere we didn't intend to go. I'm sure this offends some people, and I'm genuinely sorry if it does, but I believe this is important to say. The institutions of this country are still functioning. The courts still work. The press, despite its many failures, still exists. Civil society is still alive. Our community is not small. We have lawyers and politicians and community leaders and writers and artists and doctors and business leaders and educators. We have one of the most organized and resourceful and affluent Jewish communities in the world. We have big organizations and grassroots organizations when those other organizations just don't work for us. We have day schools. We have a legal infrastructure and a political presence and an institutional history. If we leave, we don't just give up those things for ourselves. We give them up for the community that stays. And I think we weaken the very fabric that we have spent generations building. And the people who want us gone, the people who are shooting at our shuls and marching in our streets and writing our children out of the equity curriculum, they win. Not by force, by attrition. And that is just not acceptable to me. So what do we do? I'm not going to give you a list of policy recommendations. I'm not a politician, and this is not a policy speech. But I want to say something about posture and about how to approach this moment. We need to stop kvetching, stop complaining, and start doing. I know that sounds simple. It's not. Kvetching is deeply satisfying. Kvetching is community. Kvetching is how we process difficulty without having to do anything about it. And God knows there is plenty to kvetch about. But the communities that survive, the communities that thrive, are not the ones that kvetch the loudest. They are the ones that convert their outrage into action. We need doers. We need people who look at the security gaps in our community buildings and write the check or make the call or serve on the committee. Not because someone guilted them into doing it, but because they understand that institutions don't sustain themselves. They are sustained by people who show up. We need thinkers. We need the people who can articulate who we are and why it matters, who can make the argument for Jewish continuity in a language that the 22-year-olds can hear, and who can take the 3,000-year project of Jewish civilization and explain why it's still worth something in a world that has grown so impatient with the past. We need writers. Jewish journalism in this country is thinner than it should be. Jewish cultural life is richer than it gets credit for. We need people telling our story, not just to each other, not just piggybacking off the American project, but we need people who can explain it to the rest of this country. The communities that are most visible are the communities that tell their story the best. We have extraordinary Canadian stories to tell. We need fundraisers. The money doesn't raise itself. Every program, every security guard, every teacher, every camp bed, every scholarship exists because someone did the unglamorous and essential work of asking other people to give. That work is no less important than the glamorous work. It is the infrastructure on which everything else stands. And I want to make a specific ask right now, one that costs less than you think. In the coming year, give to one fewer non-Jewish charity and give that money to a Jewish one instead. It's not because those other causes don't matter. They do. But because our house needs tending. And we cannot tend it if we are always looking at someone else's first. And we need people who understand politics, not politicians. People who understand how politics actually works. We are, understandably, deeply frustrated with the Liberal Party. I understand that frustration. The recognition of a Palestinian state, the feckless response to anti-Semitism, the performance of concern without action. I have named all of it today, and I mean every word. But the Liberals currently run this country, and the lessons we should have learned, the difficult to acknowledge lesson, is that if you publicly and full-throatedly back the horse that loses with everything that you have, the winning team notices. They remember who was in the other corner. That's not a conspiracy. That's politics. It's how it's always worked. Look at the United States. Israel has become a partisan issue there in a way that should terrify every one of us. When support for the Jewish state becomes the exclusive property of one political party, the Jewish community loses, period. It doesn't matter which party it is. The moment that Israel becomes a wedge issue, we're in trouble. And we're in trouble. We can't let that happen here to the same extent that it's happened there. We need to be smart. It means we need to advocate in every party. It means we need to play a long game instead of satisfying ourselves with short-term expressions of outrage. It means we need to be in the room even when the room is uncomfortable. And we need all of you, right here, right now, not in Florida, not in Texas, and not for most of you in Israel. Though if Israel is calling you, go with your whole heart because you're needed there too. But if your life is here, if your children go to school here, if you've built something here, and if your job can't just be picked up and moved abroad, then here is where you're needed. Now, I was brought to this country as a 1-year-old who had no say in the matter. I stay here as an adult who has every say. That is the distinction. That is the choice that I'm making right now. Recording this on the eve of Passover, speaking to you across whatever distance separates us. The Israelites didn't leave Egypt because the conditions were perfect. They left because someone decided it was time to go. Because waiting for the right moment was itself a kind of slavery. The Seder that we are going to sit down to in a few days is not just a commemoration. It's an instruction. It says, you were once in a narrow place. The word Mitzrayim for Egypt, it literally means the narrow place. You were once in a narrow place and you got out. Remember that and act accordingly. I stay here because of what this country still is, even on its worst days. A place that believes at some fundamental level that difference is not a threat, that identity is not a crime, that people can carry more than one history and still build something together. I stay because my 3 kids will likely grow up here, and I want them to grow up in a community that's worth growing up in. One that isn't diminished, not fragmented, not hollowed out from within or salted from without. A community that's alive and serious and proud and unafraid. I stay because I believe that the Canadian Jewish community, this community, our community, is one of the great achievements of Jewish history. Not just Canadian history, Jewish history. We built something here. Something that didn't exist before us and that won't survive without us. The state of Canadian Jewry is not good. I told you I was going to be honest. The threats are real. The political environment is difficult. The internal divisions are costly and the complacency that comes from decades of relative safety has left us, in some places, underprepared. We here take too much for granted, and I worry that we don't do enough. But the state of Canadian Jewry is not over, not even close. We're here. We're organized. We're smart and resourceful and loud and committed. We have the tools. We have the people. We have the history. What we need now is the will. We have to stop waiting for someone else to fix it. We have to stop waiting for the right politician or the right policy or the right moment. The moment's now. The community is you. I want to close with something that I've been thinking about. This time next year, on the eve of Passover 2027, I'd love for someone to be sitting down to record a different kind of address. I want to be able to say that our day school's expanded and there's room for every family who wants in. I want to say that we engaged the new government, that we were in the room, that we were heard, that we made progress. I'd like to say that anti-Semitic incidents are down, not because anti-Semitism disappeared, let's not kid ourselves, but because we were organized, and we pressured, and we litigated, and we made the cost of targeting Jews in this country higher than it was. I'd like to be able to say that we had the hard conversation with anti-Zionists in our midst, and that the mainstream community stopped treating their defection as a respectable opinion and started treating it as what it is. I'd like to be able to say that more people gave, more people showed up, and we needed to spend less money on security, and more people did something. That's the speech that someone needs to give next year. Whether we can give it depends entirely on what we do between now and then. Chag Pesach Sameach, happy Passover. And now, let's get to work. Thank you.